5 hours and 31 minutes. That's how long astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee had been inside the command module of Apollo Saturn 204 at the Cape Kennedy Air Force Launch Complex 34, or Pad 34 for short. 5 hours and 31 minutes, virtually lying down as they made essential tests ahead of the launch that would make them the first spacebound crew in the Apollo program, the program that would take man to the moon. 5 hours and 31 minutes before the unthinkable happened. Before one of the three men uttered the terrifying words, "Fire," in the cockpit. 30 seconds. That's all the time it took for Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee to die. And it all could have been avoided were it not for several small ironies that led to this tragic moment. 218 feet above the ground, the three astronauts climbed into the command module at 1800 hours GMT on the 27th of January 1967. They were less than a month away from their scheduled launch into space. It would have been the first manned mission in the Apollo program, NASA's final attempt to fulfill President John F. Kennedy's ambitious pledge to land an American on the moon before 1970.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Crew Commander Virgil Gus Grissom was a giant of the NASA space program. As one of NASA's first ever astronauts, the Mercury 7, he became the second American to enter space, and the second American to fly in space twice. He then successfully commanded the first flight of the Gemini program, and was chosen to do the same for the Apollo program. The mission's senior pilot, Ed White, was the first American to make a spacewalk, and this would have been his second journey into space. Roger Chaffee had been part of the space program for 5 years, and this would have been his first time in outer space. The test itself was an essential but ordinary plugs-out test, a dress rehearsal to see if the command module would perform as planned in the simulated conditions of flight in outer space. Every component of every subsystem had already been tested whilst the command module was being assembled. Then, once constructed, all spacecraft subsystems had been tested multiple times. Then alignment, subsystems and system verification and functional tests were all carried out when the module was attached to the service module. Then the backup crew, the three men prepared to replace Grissom, White and Chaffee if one or all of them fell ill or had an accident, tested the module again, several times. Throughout all these months of checks, malfunctions were noted and fixed until engineers and astronauts alike were satisfied the spacecraft was ready to fly. The final and most important test was a formality. Above all, it was considered safe. Although it was taking place high up on Pad 34, there was no fuel in the rockets, nor were there any pyrotechnics on board. And they'd done this test for every single spacecraft NASA had ever launched. It was routine. Nothing was expected to go wrong. Yet there were problems immediately. After climbing inside, Gus connected his suit to the craft's oxygen supply and noticed what he described as a sour smell. They had to stop the tests to sample the oxygen and figure out the problem. It took an hour to fix. During this pause, the astronauts discussed stopping the test altogether, but decided to continue. Next, the master alarm kept going off. It kept being triggered by high oxygen flow, but the exact reason was never resolved. Then, the communications problems began. At first, Grissom was unable to clearly speak to the control room on the ground. The crew made some adjustments, and that seemed to fix it. But then the faulty comms extended to include the operations building and the blockhouse at Pad 34. At one point, Grissom shouted, "How are we supposed to get to the moon if we can't talk between 2 or 3 buildings?" They were forced to stop the test at 2240 to troubleshoot the problem. It turned out to be a live microphone in the cabin that couldn't be turned off by the crew. They resumed the test, but the comms issue resurfaced, and they stopped again at 2320 to fix it. 11 minutes later, out of nowhere, one of the crew, probably Chaffee, calmly said, "Fire. I smell fire." 2 seconds later, Ed White declared, fire in the cockpit. Those were the last words heard from the crew. We don't know what happened next, but data from the electrocardiograms, the navigation control's motion sensors, and brushing noises from the pilot's microphone tell us that from 23:30:21, the crew were moving around, their activity getting more intense until suddenly they just stopped. Then, at 23:31:19, the command module ruptured. 3 seconds later, at 23:31:22, all voice and data transmission ended. The external camera pointed at the window of the hatch revealed flames spread through the module and burst out of the rupture, spewing thick black smoke into the tower. This intense cloud of smoke and flame prevented personnel getting close to put out the fire or let the astronauts out. Fire crews arrived in 8 minutes, and Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee's bodies were found, utterly lifeless. The flash fire raised the temperature inside to over 530 degrees Celsius, as hot as the industrial ovens used to create the parts that go into the craft. But the toxic fumes from the combusting materials knocked out the crew within seconds. The autopsies concluded that, once unconscious, resuscitation was impossible. Death came quickly, from carbon monoxide asphyxia. The positions of the bodies suggest that during those frantic few seconds of movement picked up by the sensors, the crew were carrying out the standard procedure for emergency escape. In ideal conditions, this procedure took at least 90 seconds. But in truth, this time was never achieved in any practice. Grissom had to lower White's headrest so White could reach up and behind his left shoulder to actuate a ratchet-type device for egress. The problem was the hatch, or rather, the hatches. Though there was one escape point, it consisted of 3 hatches. The middle and innermost hatches could only open inwards, and were held closed by around 28 latches which had to be operated by the ratchet. The outermost hatch was part of the ship's shield, and was designed to be jettisoned after launch before entering Earth's orbit. It took the emergency crews 5 minutes to open the hatch from the outside. Their job was made even harder by the fact that the pressure difference between inside and outside the module, intended to mimic the pressure differential in outer space, virtually sealed the door shut and made it nearly impossible to open. But why was the hatch so difficult to open in the first place? After all, the original Mercury spacecraft had a simple hatch with explosive bolts that could be triggered to shoot off the door for an emergency evacuation. So why didn't Apollo have the same type of hatch? The answer is because of Gus Grissom. The space race began after the Soviet Union's successful launch of the Sputnik 1 satellite in 1957. The following year, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was established, and Project Mercury began, its goal to put the first Americans into outer space. In 1959, 7 men were chosen for this special task, including Gus Grissom. The first Project Mercury capsules required the pilot to exit through the top hatch by squeezing through the antenna compartment after manually removing a small pressure bulkhead. The astronauts, quite rightly, felt this wasn't sufficient for a speedy exit in case of emergency, so they insisted on a side hatch fitted with explosive bolts that could be triggered from both inside and outside the capsule. On July 21, 1961, the first craft with an explosive hatch was launched, its pilot Gus Grissom. The mission was a total success, until after splashdown. Liberty Bell 7 touched down in the North Atlantic Ocean as planned, but before the recovery helicopter could secure the capsule, the hatch blew open and Grissom swiftly climbed out. The capsule sank to the bottom of the sea, the only craft lost by NASA on a successful mission. Grissom himself barely avoided drowning, but the damage was done. The loss of the capsule was an embarrassment to the nation, and speculation ran rampant that Grissom had blown the hatch in a fit of panic after his first taste of the great unknown. Naturally, Grissom insisted that the hatch had blown on its own, and his fellow astronauts believed him. But despite an official investigation and the recovery of the capsule itself in 1999, there is still no way of knowing exactly what happened. Regardless, The incident with Grissom was enough to persuade NASA to redesign the hatch yet again, removing the explosive bolts and forcing the pilot to open it manually. This manual hatch was never used on Mercury craft because by the time it was ready, Project Gemini was underway. This two-man capsule took inspiration from fighter jets and installed ejection seats for an emergency exit. But, as NASA's Director of Engineering and Development, Maxime Faget, said, the best thing about Gemini was that they never had to make an escape. The ejection seats were deeply flawed. They could only be used for the first 40 seconds after liftoff, after which the rocket was traveling too fast for the pilots to safely eject. More than that, NASA never tested the ejection seats under flight conditions. In particular, they never tested the rocket-propelled seats whilst the cabin was filled with pure oxygen, as it was during every single Gemini spaceflight. Pyrotechnics and oxygen. As astronaut Wally Schirra put it, had they actually used the ejection seats during a mission, you wouldn't have seen two astronauts, you would have seen two Roman candles. And that brings us on to the biggest mistake made on Apollo Saturn 204, later rechristened Apollo 1. The capsule was filled with a high-pressure, 100% oxygen atmosphere. After over 5 hours of testing, everything inside the craft was soaked with oxygen molecules, almost ensuring a fatal flash fire would occur at the slightest spark. And that's what NASA's Special Review Board concluded caused the fire. Their report, finished in April 1967, said the accident most probably happened because of a stray spark from a faulty wire. But the deadly fire only happened because of a sealed cabin, pressurized with an oxygen atmosphere, an extensive distribution of combustible materials in the cabin, inadequate provisions for the crew to escape, and inadequate provisions for rescue or medical assistance. NASA thought it was a perfectly safe and routine test, but the report unsurprisingly concluded that the test conditions were extremely hazardous. Adequate safety precautions were neither established nor observed for this test. Moreover, no procedures for this type of emergency had been established either for the crew or for the spacecraft pad work team. In short, NASA had never even considered the possibility of a fire in the capsule. How had NASA, the best funded and most advanced collection of engineering minds ever assembled, made such a huge mistake? The inevitable Senate hearings reported that no single person bears all of the responsibility for the Apollo 204 accident. It happened because many people made the mistake of failing to recognize a hazardous situation. NASA's long history of successes in testing and launching space vehicles with pure oxygen environments led to overconfidence and complacency. NASA had fallen victim to perceptual blindness. According to cognitive scientists, this is the phenomenon where we can fail to see the startlingly obvious even though we're doing our utmost to focus on the task at hand. In this case, the scientists and engineers behind the space program were so distracted by the unprecedented challenges of traveling through space that they forgot about the age-old risk of a fire on the ground. It was a long 18 months of investigation, analysis, and redesigning before the next manned mission to space. The wiring was made safer, combustible materials inside the capsule were removed, and those fewer flammable materials were placed further apart from each other and from potential sources of ignition. They stopped using a pure oxygen atmosphere, mixing the gas with nitrogen to reduce the amount of fuel for a fire. Most importantly, the hatch was drastically redesigned. The inner and middle hatches were combined into one. Instead of opening inwards, it opened outwards. Instead of requiring a manual ratchet to open the latches, the pilot would pump a handle to activate a pressurized nitrogen cylinder that unlocked the door. It didn't have explosive bolts, but it could be opened in 5 seconds, allowing the astronauts to get out within 30 seconds. History shows that, although the journey to the moon had more bumps along the way,
Houston, we have a problem.
No more astronauts were lost to the Apollo program. On July the 20th, 1969, 2.5 years after the tragic fire, and exactly 8 years after Gus Grissom nearly drowned in the Atlantic, NASA delivered on JFK's promise to land a man on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Yet it's quite possible that even though the Apollo program was delayed by 18 months to redesign the spacecraft and the safety procedures, if Gus Grissom, Ed White and Roger Chaffee hadn't died, then JFK's promise would have been broken. The Senate report stated that, had there been no disaster, important shortcomings in management, scheduling, design, production, and quality control might never have come to light. 3 courageous men lost their lives in this tragic accident. They died in the service of their country. Because of their deaths, manned spaceflight will be safer for those who follow them. In his autobiography, Chief Astronaut Deke Slayton wrote that his first choice for the man on the moon was not Neil Armstrong, but Gus Grissom. Had Gus been alive as a Mercury astronaut, he would have taken the step. We will never know exactly why the fire started. It was probably a stray spark in the wiring near Gus Grissom. He was the first to burn, and may have been the first to die. He was one of the men who insisted on a fast-release explosive hatch on the first manned spaceflights. He was a major reason those hatches were abandoned. And that may be why he, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were unable to escape. But, ironically, by giving their lives to the lofty goal of putting men on the moon, they may have inadvertently guaranteed that NASA achieved that goal, not once, but twice by the end of 1969. NASA got its act together, overcame its perceptual blindness. America won the space race. The tragedy of 1967 may be why. Thanks for sticking with me throughout this rather depressing story, and especially big thank you to all of our Patreon supporters and YouTube members, whose names you can see on screen right now. Please feel free to check out our regular podcast episodes, as well as the other videos we've made in this playlist about topics that we find just interesting. Weird, that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.